So our plan of attack is we need to prove that AE is perpendicular to BC. We can do that if we prove that these two angles are congruent, because if those two angles are both congruent and supplementary, then they must both be 90. So we're going to prove that they're congruent by proving these triangles are congruent. And so if the triangles are congruent, their pieces are congruent. If those angles are congruent and supplementary, then they must be 90, and then these lines must be perpendicular. So we need to write all that out. So first step, given, you just write it all out, and then we mark what they give us. So they told us that ABC is isosceles, so we're going to have a step in our proof that this is congruent to that because of the definition of isosceles. AB is congruent to AC. Oh, so they just tell us that. Okay, so we don't need a step for that. It's given. E is the midpoint. So if E is the midpoint, then it must break it up into two congruent segments. So we'll have that. And, okay, so that's what they give us. And we know if these two sides are congruent, then these two angles are congruent because you have an isosceles triangle theorem that we say there. So we need so we can see that these triangles are going to be congruent by side, angle, side congruence. And so we have to state each one of those out explicitly. So there's the side that they gave us in the given. Here's another side they gave us because that's the definition of midpoint. Here's the angle that we talked about because the isosceles triangle theorem, if these sides are congruent, then those angles are congruent. And so now the triangles are congruent by side, angle, side congruence. And if the triangles are congruent, the whole point of proving them congruent is to prove their parts are congruent. So we wanted these angles, and I don't know they're right yet, but I know these angles must be congruent because corresponding parts of congruent triangles must be congruent. And then, so now we have that, and then we have to go farther. So you can see that AEB, and AEC, those two angles we just said, must be supplementary because they're a linear pair. Together they form a straight line. And because they're supplementary, by definition they must add to 180. And then they simply substituted in, they kept AEB the same, but instead of writing AEC, that was AEC, they wrote AEB because we said that AEB was the same as AEC. So that was a substitution. They just replaced AEC with AEB, alphabet soup, because they were congruent by that step there. Oh, you can read it now. And then, and so then combining like terms or simplifying, there are two of those angles, and then simply dividing both sides by 2, they got 90 by your division property of equality. And then because they make a 90-degree angle, then the lines that make them must be perpendicular by the definition of perpendicular. Yahoo!